funding. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Alec Williams, the policy analyst at Enterprise Community Partners, and I'll let Alec introduce himself and run through what they're seeing at the federal level. Alec?
Well, thank you, Allison, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you all today. As Allison mentioned, I am policy analyst at Enterprise Community Partners and focused on our federal appropriations work. I want to start off by just taking a quick look back at what Congress has done to respond to the coronavirus up until this point. And as we can see on this slide here, the response really started back in the first week of March, when the Phase 1 package, the fiscal year 2020 coronavirus preparedness and response supplemental, was signed into law. Since then, we have seen 4 other relief packages passed by Congress, the largest and most noteworthy, of course, being the CARES Act, which surpassed $2 trillion of aid to help support our healthcare system, American businesses, state and local governments, and the millions of Americans impacted by the spread of the virus and the economic slowdown. The latest 2 packages signed into law, as you can see there, on April 24th and June 5th, in large part have to do with plussing up and improving the PPP program. And I'll touch on that in a second, and we can go to the next slide. So I know at this point, most on the webinar today are probably pretty familiar with a lot of the programs that were included in the CARES Act and in the more recent Enhancement Act. So I will not dive into the details of these programs, but here's a brief summary of some of the major non-housing programs as a reference. And I also wanted to include this because we are starting to see some of these programs come back into the fold of things and factor into current negotiations on the Hill. There are 2 in particular that are proving to be major sticking points. I'll start with the Paycheck Protection Program because today is actually a landmark day for the program. We're now 3 months from the initial appropriation in CARES, and the application window for those PPP loans will close today. And it will close with about $134 billion in funds still available for the SBA to disperse. And that surplus, the remaining amount, has sort of sparked a new debate over what to do with those remaining funds. The Senate Democrats have proposed legislation that would allow small businesses to take out a second PPP loan if they have 100 or fewer employees. Previously, the program was generally open to companies with 500 or fewer workers. So they're looking to just narrow the scope there a little bit. And there have been alternative proposals put forward as well. You have Senators Kevin Kramer from North Dakota and Kirsten Sinema from Arizona planning on introducing legislation that would forgive all the loans under $150,000. So I just wanted to mention that because it might be relevant for some of your organizations or organizations you are partnering with or working with. And again, I think this will be a major point of debate in the weeks and months ahead. The second program I wanted to provide a brief update on are the unemployment benefits the CARES Act strengthened. We know that CARES added that $600 a week across the board federal payment increase on top of the state benefits. And this was scheduled to last through the end of July. We are fast approaching that deadline, and again, we're seeing a divergence on the Hill on how this situation should be handled moving forward. There have been some individuals from the administration who have voiced their support for ending the added payments as planned, and there's some Republicans on the Hill who are adamantly opposed to the extension of the program. They believe the way the system is designed, you're actually incentivizing people to stay on unemployment. Then you have some Democrats who believe these dollars are truly necessary and making a big difference for families in the American economy at large. Just for context, there are still about 30 million Americans who are receiving these benefits. So again, this will certainly be a topic of debate in the coming months and will be a part of the conversation for the next COVID package. And with that, we can go to the next slide. Another program included in the CARES Act was the Coronavirus Relief Fund, set up $150 billion for state, tribal, and local governments, really to just help broadly cover any necessary expenditures that were incurred due to the coronavirus. As far as how these funds can be utilized, while the funding cannot be used to replace already allocated state funds, the nature of these dollars is broad, and we believe that state and local governments could use these dollars to help address the needs of people experiencing homelessness and low-income renters impacted by the pandemic. It's my understanding, after speaking actually with Enterprise's state and local policy director in Ohio, Emily Lungard, who is based in Cleveland, that alongside the GOPC, there are a group of organizations calling for at least $100 million of Ohio's relief fund to be used for emergency rental assistance for unemployed tenants. And again, based on our interpretation of the legislation, this would be absolutely be an acceptable use of those dollars. We can go to the next slide and transition over to what we're seeing from HUD. In the CARES Act, they saw one of its largest ever one-time increases in federal funding with an allocation of around $12 billion, or what equates to roughly a quarter of HUD's annual budget. And you can see the full list of programs that were funded and the total amount that they are slotted to receive. As far as where HUD stands in the process of getting these dollars out the door, they've completed, as of now, 4 main waves of allocations. The first happened on April 2nd. They made $2 billion of the CDBG funding available, $1 billion of the ESG, those homeless assistance grants, and $63.7 million of the HOPWA dollars were also made available, so pretty much tapping that account completely. They followed up a month later on May 11th and made $685 million of the public housing operating fund available, so the total amount there. And they also did an additional $1 billion of CDBG. Wave 3 happened at the beginning of this month, and they allotted $2.96 billion of the emergency solutions grant, so pretty much bringing it to the total of $4 billion that was provided. And their most recent action happened on June 24th, where they released close to $1 million of that last bullet point, the Fair Housing Enforcement Funds, to 19 states. So they started the process of dispersing those dollars. I wish I had more of a sense of timing to share with you today around when we'll see the dollars in the remaining accounts flow. But based on communication from HUD, all I can really say is, they're trying to get these dollars out the door as quickly and responsibly as possible, with still a lot of work left to do with Section 202, 811, and some of these CDBG dollars as well. With that, we can go to the next slide. And specifically for the CDBG CV funding, I wanted to include this slide that just breaks down how these dollars are being distributed. That first wave that I mentioned was direct funding to states and localities under the CDBG program's current formula, so what they were using for FY20. The second wave of $1 billion was directly for states and insular areas, and states can use this money in non-entitlement and in entitlement areas. And the remaining $2 billion will be allocated now on a rolling basis based on a formula that's to be determined by Secretary Carson. And it will take into account coronavirus-related factors, including housing impact is one of the things they're looking at. And then a few other things of note that I wanted to mention about the CDBG dollars. Unlike the annual CDBG program, these dollars will be available with no caps on the amount that can be sub-granted to nonprofits that provide housing or education, childcare, elder services. And also the grantees can use these CDBG dollars for rental assistance without a waiver for up to 3 months. In order to do this, it must be paid to the landlord, not the tenant. And the only thing a city needs to do to provide this emergency rental assistance is amend its action plan. What's still to be determined is whether or not HUD will issue a waiver allowing rental assistance beyond 3 months. This is something that certainly a lot of people are pushing for. They definitely have the authority to issue this kind of waiver, but historically, they're not used to thinking of CDBG as a source of rental assistance. So that's why there's been a little bit of hesitance there. And with that, we can go to the next slide and sort of discuss what we're seeing next, what's going to happen next. First thing I'll touch on May 15th, the House passed the Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Solutions Act, or just HEROES as it's being referred to. And the purpose here was really to detail House leadership's priorities for what they wanted included in the next coronavirus package. If enacted, HEROES would deliver almost $1 trillion in aid to state and local governments. The bill also calls for another round of the $1,200 economic impact payments that were included in CARES. It would extend those unemployment benefits that we discussed earlier. It would also make some additional changes to the PPP and economic injury disaster loan programs. HEROES would also provide resources for affordable housing and community development programs at HUD, USDA, and Treasury. We were definitely thrilled to see the inclusion of the USDA housing assistance services in HEROES, because that was something that was not in CARES. And I think the big ticket item in HEROES relating to housing, there's $100 billion allocated for emergency rental assistance. As I noted earlier, this passed in the House on May 15th, and the Senate is yet to consider the measure. Senate Republicans have said they want to wait and see the full impact of CARE dollars before proceeding on to the next package. But there was one notable development from this past week in relation to HEROES. The House Democrats made the decision to pull all the relevant housing provisions from HEROES and make it its own legislation. And they called this bill the Emergency Housing Protection and Relief Act of 2020. And they are now scheduled to vote on that this week. I think their logic, or what they're hoping for, is that the Senate would be more likely to consider the measure narrow in scope. The House is also scheduled to vote on the Moving Forward Act this week. As you can see there, the bill was unveiled on June 18th, and it outlined House Democrats' plan to rebuild America's infrastructure. I think the total price of the legislation is around $1.5 trillion, and it's going towards transportation, expanding broadband, energy, and education infrastructure. In addition to providing over $100 billion in funding for affordable housing infrastructure. It would also strengthen and expand the low-income housing tax credit, as well as expand and make permanent new markets tax credit. We expect this to pass the House this week. As I said, they're scheduled to vote on it. And similar to HEROES, the package as a whole is unlikely to be voted on and passed in the Senate. But there is a chance that certain provisions might be pulled from this bill and ultimately included in the next and likely final coronavirus relief package. So certain provisions that are popular amongst both Senate and Democrat Republicans might get pulled from HEROES, pulled from the Moving Forward Act, and put into their final coronavirus response package. And if we see something move, it's likely going to be later on this summer, tail end of July or into August. That's what we're hearing around timing as of now. And with that, we can go to the next slide.
Great. Alec, thank you for this, the rundown on federal dollars. It's so good to know. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing at the state level, because so much of what we are seeing actually is coming from the federal level, just given the situation that the state is in. So as Alec described, there was the CDBG coronavirus tranche 1 and tranche 2 have been announced. Tranche 1, so CD1, only went to, as Alec described, to the non-entitlement communities across the state. And that was about $27 million, which effectively is going to be distributed and managed through community action agencies in the state. So if you are in a more rural area and a non-entitlement community, your community action agency is likely to be the one who frankly is going to be the one that's actually implementing the various projects that get proposed and approved by ODSA, the Ohio Development Services Agency. The second tranche of dollars, which is about $37 million, is available for entitlement communities. So our large cities and large urban counties are able to apply to those dollars. We have been encouraging, from Greater Ohio, we've been encouraging ODSA to use those dollars either for rental assistance or minimally at least to take into consideration the real needs of the entire state, including our urban areas. What ODSA told us about a month ago was that they had not even received the first tranche, and that the second tranche they weren't expecting until July, and so they were reluctant to make any decisions until the money was in hand. The emergency shelter grant, again through the coronavirus relief dollars, Ohio got about $21 million of that, and much of that is going to flow through continuums of care, and I believe is actually already starting to flow. So, and I may be wrong about that, but all of these dollars need to be in the works soon, particularly the State CARES Act dollars. This is because this money, particularly the State CARES Act dollars, have to be allocated out by the end of the year. So just last week on June 19, what was HB 310, which is now HB 481, was passed. And that was the bill that finally provides dollars to local governments to pay for corona-related expenses. Again, this cannot replace lost tax revenue, but it can be utilized to pay for increased testing sites and hospital, et cetera. What's important to know is that your local community needs to have a resolution on hand, and so does your county, because the resolutions are required to basically establish funds, which then the state can distribute the money into. That bill, what ended up being House Bill 481, released $350 million to the local governments in the state. The Ohio Municipal League and other local government membership organizations estimate there's another $850 million left in the CARES Act dollars that Ohio received that should be earmarked for local communities. Now, the question is, when will that money come? How much will it be? How many tranches? And we don't know that for sure. What we do know, at least from Greater Ohio, is that we're fairly confident that the state, and I should say, the money within the CARES Act dollars, there's the 850 that still sits, that's basically earmarked for local governments, but there is potentially up to another billion or 2 billion still sitting in that fund, all of which has to go out by the end of the year. We believe at Greater Ohio that the state is continuing to hold on to that money for a few reasons. One, we think that the state is hedging its bets, anticipating increased expenses in the fall, whether that's contact tracing, hospital facilities, et cetera. So it's holding on to those dollars. Two, I think the state, like so many of us, are hoping that the feds will extend the timeline for allocation so that these dollars may not actually have to be out the door, or at least pledged by the end of the year, that maybe there can be an extension on that timeline. Three, I know that certainly the local governments are hoping that the terms of the use can change. Again, this will require federal guidance, not at the states, but that the use can be changed, such as being used for revenue replacement. So there's a lot of questions around those dollars because they're somewhat flexible now. There should be more flexibility. Our local governments are in a real need. Needless to say, our local governments really want additional rounds of funding to be released sooner than later. Again, hopefully though, with even more relaxed guidance on how those dollars can and cannot be used. As Alec mentioned, Greater Ohio is part of a very diverse, large coalition that is asking the state for $100 million to be set aside out of the CARES money to be used for emergency rental assistance, primarily targeting and prioritizing those households that have been directly impacted by COVID, whether because of lost jobs or because they've gotten ill and no longer have income coming in. We have been working with Ohio, Enterprise Community Partners, the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio, and others. Again, there's a large and diverse coalition, over 100 signatures on the letter to the governor asking for those dollars to be earmarked to that 100 million. Right now, that is still up in the air. That has not been decided. And so we keep our fingers crossed and maybe calling on you all to help continue to put some pressure on. I also want to move on and talk about some other state programs that we know, at least right now, are still functioning. So the longstanding state competitive grant programs, the longstanding loan programs are still operating right now. And so the list here on this slide is not an exhaustive list, but a list of the common either agencies that provide grants or loans, or some of the specific programs, such as the Historic Preservation Tax Credit or Safe Routes to School. What I do want to say right now is that the governor has already said over a month ago, 2 months ago probably at this point, that the next state budget needs to be reduced by 20%, and that he is asking every agency to cut their expenses by 20%. And that is a huge reduction. Just to give some perspective, during the housing crisis 2008-2009, when we were deep in that recession, Governor Strickland at the time did claw back about $2 or $3 billion, and that was just 2% of the budget. And as you may recall, if you were in Ohio at that time, that's when funding for libraries was on the chopping block, and a lot of community development programs were either reduced funding or zeroed out. So if that's only 2 or 3% of the budget, a 20% cut to the state budget is going to be huge. So this is all to say that while these programs on the slide right now exist, we at Greater Ohio are very concerned about what the future may hold for the programs that we think are vital and important for our communities, particularly our legacy communities, as they work to revitalize and thrive. But that's a different discussion. We can get into that in the Q&A on what we think needs to be done in preparation to protect those, but just as a sense, to give you a sense of where we think things are going right now. Actually, one last thing I wanted, Lindsay, I'm going to flip back for a second to the previous slide. You'll see that Jobs Ohio is the second to last bullet on here. And the this organization, you know, for many years has focused on fairly traditional economic development metrics and projects. That said, they have been indicating and telegraphing over the last 3 or 4 months that they are considering sort of expanding their portfolio in order to support the overall goals and mission of the organization. They, in their June board meetings, described it as their vibrancy program, which not a whole lot of details have become public so far, but in private conversations that they've been having and private presentations that they've been making to various stakeholders around the state, our understanding at Greater Ohio at least is that this vibrancy program could potentially help with, for example, downtown revitalization, for example, like a building, or could help with redeveloping a small manufacturing site that may not have the exact job profile that Jobs Ohio prefers, or the minimum numbers that Jobs Ohio typically requires. Again, there's a lot of details that are still to come around this vibrancy program, but we at Greater Ohio have a lot of hope and have been talking to Jobs Ohio for a while on how important it is to pair more community development oriented work with the traditional economic development work that they do in order to have long-term sustainable success in the state. So we continue to watch that very closely and encourage you all to continue to talk to your regional affiliates on the importance of vibrancy revitalization work to support the traditional economic development work. I'm going to stop here right now and see if there's any questions that anyone has in terms of the kind of funding and where things sit, either at the federal or state level. Go ahead and submit that through the chat box, which you can access down at the bottom of your screen. And we'll see if there's any questions now. And again, also we'll have a Q&A option at the end, but wanted to make sure that before we switch gears to talking about how to successfully capture funding and compete for funding, that we give you a chance to ask if there was any kind of technical questions that you had around the state or federal dollars. Okay. Seeing none right now, let's move on. But again, hope that don't be shy. So I want to talk now about what competing for funding looks like, where we see success and where we, recommendations that we can provide to you today on putting forth your best foot. So if you currently have a strategic plan or a vision for your community, this is obvious, but we'll say it anyway, funding needs to advance that plan. What we know is that demonstrating to awarding entities like Ohio Development Services Agency, Ohio EPA, et cetera, that a plan can demonstrate to those awarding entities, to elected leaders, and the voting public that any request for funding is plugging into an existing, well thought out plan. Including your plan and letters of support in your application is very typical. We strongly encourage that. Again, we know that ODSA, HUD, basically any state or federal agency that is going to provide dollars, they like to know that their funds are being stretched and are not the only money in a project. And a plan really helps signal that. Additionally, it signals the community-wide commitment to the success of those dollars. As I said, it typically indicates that there's multiple sources for the project or initiative that you're trying to advance. It also, a plan typically says, signals that there's an understanding that community turnaround takes time and that metrics for tracking progress and success are in place, both for the community's benefit, but also the funding agencies. I will say that ODSA has told us privately in meetings that they feel more confident in communities that have plans, particularly plans with metrics and for success, than if they are approached by a community that doesn't have a plan. And that those communities with plans, whether that's a neighborhood plan, a downtown revitalization plan, a comprehensive master plan, whatever you are seeking funding for, if there is a clear, if it's not just on the back of a napkin, but a clear sense of sort of arc and trajectory to the work, the agency feels more comfortable making investments into that. And based on our fairly informal review, we would say that yes, the communities typically win more competitive funds when there is a plan in place. Now, the next slide gives a list of just some example plans that are in process and in the works around the state. We will be providing a recording, a copy of this of the slides and this recording, so feel free to navigate to these various plans on your own time. But just to give you a sense, they can range in, and these are more kind of housing focused, not entirely, but a little more housing and neighborhood focused. But there's certainly other economic development plans, business development, entrepreneurs. There's a whole range of what plans could look like. But again, what we know is that investing in a community that has a plan brings a higher level of comfort and confidence to the agency. So if you don't have a plan in your community, don't worry, you're not the only community. There's many of them across the state and across the country that don't have a plan, or at least a plan that feels relevant and timely to today. We know that there are communities that may have a plan that's on the shelf, but it was written in the 1980s and sort of contemplates a future that is not what today is. So again, don't worry, and this is not to say that if you don't have a plan, you can't compete for funding. This is just to say that if you did have a plan, even if it's fairly thin on details, that will provide you with a little leg up. But if you don't have a plan, don't worry. We know that, that you can't fix everything, particularly right now in the budgetary environment that we're in. So we are recommending you focus on issues that are urgent and that are of key priority, key community priorities, and ones that are primed for success. And when we say an urgent issue that's primed for success, it may be primed for success because there's already a working group formed around the issue, for example, or you have active and engaged neighbors who are ready to be mobilized. Or maybe you have an existing merchants association or another constituency group that is ready to channel their energies into. Or you might have cross-sector support around XYZ issue. Or you may have a trusted champion and community trusted champions that can move grass tops and grassroots leaders. These are what I mean by you want to focus on priorities that are already primed for success. We also are suggesting that you focus just on 1 or 2 priorities so that it's clear that any funding you receive is not going to get spread like peanut butter and so have minimal or no impact. But also this helps you, and again provides to those agencies providing dollars, that it's clear that you are able to say yes to many things that relate to those priorities, but that you're also in a position to say no. And when you choose priorities, you are necessarily accepting the fact that you may have to say no to competing, very valid concerns, but those may not be the top priority concerns for your community. When I say 1 or 2 priorities, here's some examples. You may say, we want to prevent housing stock in neighborhood A and neighborhood B from declining and losing value over the next 3 years as we ride out the COVID recession and recovery period. Or you may say, we want to prevent housing instability and homelessness from increasing by more than 10% from pre-COVID rates. Or we want to preserve 60% of our downtown businesses. Or we want to ensure that residents have sufficient food through April of 2021. These are fairly short-term. They're priorities that have some time limitations to them. They have some metrics to them. And these are priorities that feel like that are important, that can also lay the groundwork for longer term revitalization and sustainability work, but are also ones that are addressing urgent needs today. And of course, there's many, many others. Those are just some examples. One thing that I want to say from our experience in observing the 2008-2009 housing crisis is that communities during that period, which is not exactly an apples to apples comparison, but there are a lot of similarities to where we stand today. What we saw then, 12 years ago, we saw communities take basically 2 paths. So the first was sort of the squeaky wheel response path, which was that if you had squeaky wheels who were complaining about the blighted property next door or some issue down the way, but it was fairly localized, communities were responding to that. And that's important. We need to respond to our squeaky wheels. We need to respond to our really blighted properties. But we also saw communities in 2008, 2009 decide to take a really deliberate resource targeting strategy to stabilize and strengthen specific target areas. And the nature of the 2008-2009 housing crisis made it very geographically felt, whereas this COVID crisis may not be as geographically felt. Everyone's experiencing it. But I would still say that neighborhoods and different communities in our cities are feeling it disproportionately, experiencing it disproportionately. And so there may be some geographic targeting. What we saw again in 2008-2009 was that those communities that plotted out the areas that they wanted to strengthen and redevelop focused their demolition dollars to those areas. And 10 years later, many of those neighborhoods are now stable or were on the path to strengthening pre-COVID. Those communities that tore down the worst houses, but didn't necessarily concentrate those efforts to a specific area to really kind of build up to something bigger and larger, now have a lot of empty lots, but not a whole lot of market strengthening. And that's what I mean by the kind of the squeaky wheel response. This is not to disparage the need to get rid of some really terrible housing stock that was around in 2008, 2009. But without that longer term plan in place, now we have a bunch of empty lots in some communities instead of sort of an aggregated larger parcel that could be repositioned and redeveloped for something larger, bigger, and more catalytic. So this is just to say, this is one lesson that we think has been really important to carry forward as we start thinking about recovery during this pandemic period, is balancing the need to respond to critical issues today, certainly those urgent concerns, but also making sure that the foundation for future investments, momentum, and future recovery is also being contemplated at the same time. It's hard, we know that's hard, but again, going back to sort of the plan or the priority comments earlier, that longer term vision is what gives confidence to granting agencies that those dollars are going to be used wisely and that they're going to be stretched in all the ways possible. I'm going to stop here. let me check the chat box, which is empty. And we're going to stop here and see if there's any questions or comments for Alec or myself, whether about funding or whether about just sort of getting yourselves into a competitive position to attract funding in the future.
Hey, Allison, it's Brady Groves.
Hey, Brady.
Hey, a little more about the vibrancy program, and you have some familiarity with the Mansfield Rising program, and not to be too specific, but what would be some key elements they would be looking for as far as partnerships or favored status projects and making a grant for those funds?
Right. That's a great question, Brady. And I'm going to first say, I think Mansfield Rising was listed as one of the example plans in our slides. And certainly I encourage everyone to check out the Mansfield Rising plan, which is really a plan about repositioning and strengthening downtown Mansfield. And it's a great plan. It was extremely community driven. Brady, to your question, I think, again, I don't want to speak on behalf of Jobs Ohio, and it's not like I have a ton of insider knowledge here, but or any insider knowledge. But I would say that from sort of the signals they're putting out, and if we kind of triangulate around it, they're interested in individual buildings. I think that this is going to be a new area for them. And so if you can say, we want $100,000 to put a new roof on and redevelop the facade for this really important catalytic building. And once we do that with your money, Jobs Ohio, we expect this investor to come in and put in a coffee shop, and this investor to come in and put in a incubator. And this is the way that the building is going to get activated. And then how does that build out, sort of the ripple effect along the rest of the block? My sense is that for those of you who are familiar with Chillicothe and a very catalytic building down there, Jobs Ohio did put some money in there. They thought that was a great experience, but that is really the most experience they have in this space. And so I think they really are still looking at sort of at a building by building approach. Asking them for money for like planters and beautification, I think is going to be a lower priority for them than if you can make that tie back to how it creates the job opportunities, creates a more competitive business environment, while also having these sort of other impacts around the community, whether that's a reactivated building that has housing in it or not. Brady, I hope that's helpful, and for others as well.
Yes, thank you.
Other questions or comments? And I should say, as we get more information about the vibrancy programs out of Jobs Ohio, we're happy to share that through our website. And we often share this kind of information in our monthly newsletters as well. So we know that there's a number of communities on the call, and I can see you all on the participant list. So I would be curious to know if you feel like you have figured out a successful strategy for attracting competitive funding, not even competitive funding, but also feel like you've really utilized dollars well. If you wanted to share that example with others on the call. Okay, well, I am not going to play teacher and call you out as much as I want to, but I won't do that. Alec, is there any final comments that you want to offer before we wrap up today, particularly in light of sort of what you've just learned about Ohio and, again, sort of any other scuttlebutt around Capitol Hill that you think folks here should know about?
I think it's sort of included the latest I've heard around those two major packages moving forward. But I can definitely share my email with you as well, Allison. And if anyone ever has any questions or wants to follow up on any of the things I discussed, I'd be more than happy to talk these issues through with you.
Great. Thank you. Well, before we let you go, one thing as I sort of mentioned at the front end, is that we are concerned about basically austerity budgeting in the next state budget. So the next state budget is going to be it will start to be debated in February and passed by June of 2021. And so I would request that those of you who are on the call who either currently utilize state programs or are contemplating going after a state program, so whether that's the historic preservation tax credit or state new markets tax credit, that there would be, we would love to know from you privately what it is that you are utilizing so that we can start to build a defense and build a case for why those are important programs to maintain. So I will stop there. I see that there's some chatter, which I appreciate. I'm going to read through this real fast, but oh yes, okay. So Carly is saying, one of the biggest mistakes. Carly is saying okay, so our colleague Carly Booz, who now works for the Affordable Housing Alliance Central Ohio, is saying that just mistakes overall in your proposal can knock you out, right? So kind of just administrative mistakes. So please make sure that your request is within the guidelines that are being offered by the agency, and that may just require some creative writing on your end. I'm allowed to say that. Carly is a former state grant mentor, may not, but just be creative in making sure that your request fits within the guidelines that are being established by the agency in order to successfully compete for those dollars. Any other chats or questions before we let folks go? Okay, again, well, we will be posting this webinar, the slides, as well as the recording on the Greater Ohio website here within the next few days, and then also making sure that it's accessible through our various social media accounts. So we encourage you to follow us there, as well as the National Resource Network and Enterprise Community Partners. With that, thank you so much for your afternoon. Alec, thanks so much for dropping in from DC, and everyone have a great afternoon. Thanks so much.